My artwork has always been about my family, about the magic that is a Black American family surviving in America. And to have this FBI file that was basically attacking all of those things, I knew it would work its way into my artwork. Despite the fact that my dad had served in Vietnam, despite the fact that he's taking care of his family and just a regular citizen, this information is being collected because he's considered an enemy by his own government.
In the US, there's a long history of government surveillance of Black civil rights groups. It was supposed to have ended in the 1970s. But today, there is a similar threat against Black Lives Matter, a movement fighting to end systemic violence against Black people. In this Fault Lines, we reveal new details about surveillance of Black Lives Matter. And we show how far the government can go when its powers remain unchecked. For organizers in the Black Lives Matter movement, the threat of surveillance is a reminder of what happened to their parents' generation. And it's just recently that people have been able to see the extent of that monitoring. We've come to Oakland, California to better understand this history. And we start with the story of an artist and her father.
When I was 12 years old, I saw a picture in one of the Black newspapers. I think it was called the Pittsburgh Courier. And it was a picture of a Black man being lynched and burnt, and white people celebrating and cutting body parts off. And at that point, I asked God, I said, what did we do to deserve it? What kind of people, would do that? So since really young, I knew that something was wrong.
In the exhibition, the two photographs that are next to each other are one of my dad in his military uniform. He's just been drafted. He's going to be sent to Vietnam.
Rodney Barnette grew up in a segregated United States. He was drafted to go to Vietnam at the age of 21 and returned a year later wounded in the line of duty.
The photograph next to it is after he's come back from the war. He looks older, a little wiser. He's seen some terrible things. He's lost friends.
I was watching on the news, the police were conducting the same kind of operations that we did in the war. So I was outraged that they were treating Black people, they were killing Black people, beating Black people up.
So you have this whole generation of people that are coming back from the war and wondering, why did I just almost die for a country that doesn't have a place for me? His answer about what he can do is to join the Black Panther Party.
And this is right after the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King was killed, Malcolm X was killed. This was an extension to what the civil rights movement was trying to achieve.
While the Black Panther Party has often been projected as only an armed movement, Rodney says the focus for most of them was on community building. The Panthers demanded an end to police brutality and equal rights to housing and employment.
In LA, we were organizing around churches and other organizations and trying to get free breakfast programs for children going to school.
What Rodney and the entire world would learn some years later was just how much their community organizing threatened the government.
J. Edgar Hoover famously said that the most dangerous element of the Black Panther Party was the free breakfast program, because he knew that that could really unify a community and draw attention to the needs that aren't being met.
J. Edgar Hoover oversaw the US Federal Bureau of Investigation, or the FBI. And in 1972, Hoover's notoriously unconstitutional program, named COINTELPRO, was exposed. This was a counterintelligence program that labeled almost all leftist groups a terrorist threat and targeted Martin Luther King Jr., anti-war activists, and the Black Panthers, among others. The goal of the program was destroy and discredit the groups it targeted. Thousands of pages would show evidence of infiltration and assassinations by the FBI to achieve just that. Rodney would be swept up in this mass surveillance. 2 years ago, Rodney saw his own FBI file for the first time.
So you get these files. Describe what that was like to read about yourself.
It was amazing. They tried to build cases against me. They tried to say that I harbored a fugitive, that I was gonna receive stolen weapons, anything that they could use to justify doing something further to me.
There's one page where an informant is at a Black Panther meeting and observes that my father is wearing his post office uniform, tells the FBI that my dad works at the post office.
The FBI would use this information to go after his job, even when Rodney's managers reported that he was a good worker.
So they terminated me for cohabiting with a woman that I wasn't married to, and they called it conduct unbecoming of a government employee. So I was fired.
Sadie's work is meant to pay homage to her father's generation and to show up close how the government's program fabricated stories to fracture a movement and destroy lives.
One thing I hope that people will take away from this work is really connecting family history with capital H history. And you know, that really is what was at stake. Like, that's what the Black Panthers were fighting for, was for their children to be able to grow up safely, to not be underfed and underserved, to not be murdered by the police.
There's always been a percentage of Black people that constantly fought against white supremacy. And it's white supremacy that in reality that we've been fighting against all these years and still have to fight against.
I don't even think that I've had to work very hard in curating these viewing experiences for people to connect it to today.
Don't touch me, please. Girl came over, gave us a bag of baby.
The politics and the optics of today have done that for themselves.
History has shown us that this is what they do. And there's no reason to think that they're not doing the same thing now as they were before.
In the last few years, videos of police brutality have brought the issue sharply back into focus.
Man, I've been recording this. I've been recording it. What car they come out of, yo?
Black Lives Matter has been a direct response to the police killings of unarmed Black men and women around the US. Activists around the country began to feel various forms of intimidation and aggression by law enforcement. US journalists revealed stories of FBI knocking on activists' doors, collecting social media information, and arresting protesters for low-level offenses. The reaction by authorities to people's demands for equal treatment felt eerily familiar.
We heard stories of people being followed around grocery stores and being called by their social media handle as opposed to their actual name.
Brandy Collins at Color of Change has been tracking allegations of surveillance for a few years.
Cleveland, on and on. Stories that sounded too similar to us for it to be accidental, but what we saw as part of a continued larger coordinated effort similar to what we saw in the 60s and 70s.
Her organization first filed a Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, request to obtain federal surveillance records from August 2014 to June 2016. But they ultimately had to sue and have been in court for almost a year.
So the counterintelligence program that allegedly has been dismantled by the government, we felt pretty clear that some form of that was continuing to occur right now.
Why are they being checked out by government agencies?
The movement for Black Lives really has emerged, and Black Lives Matters has emerged as this powerful movement beyond a hashtag. And I think that was, a threat to the powers that be and a threat to police departments.
Sit down for Michael Brown. Sit down for Michael Brown.
What started spontaneously in late 2014, a protest around the shooting of Michael Brown, bled into cities across the US where other Black men and women were being killed by police.
This is about Freddie Gray. This is about unarmed Black men and women being killed by police every day.
A simple hashtag became a rallying cry. Black Lives Matter. And the movement for Black Lives became a coalition of groups fighting for equal treatment.
Justice! Justice for Freddie Gray!
It's a movement that starts from one point.
The simple request of stop killing us. The simple idea that Black folks should be entitled to a certain amount of dignity and rights and should be able to walk outside their house and not fear being gunned down by police officers for any number of reasons. And this movement is about reclaiming what it means to exist in dignity and how to have a real conversation around what police have meant in our communities from the beginning of policing.
I can't breathe! I can't breathe!
The calls for justice reverberated around the US. In New York City, thousands of people protested when the officers who killed Michael Brown and Eric Garner faced no indictments.
Shut it down! Shut it down!
Shut it down! Shut it down! What are you? Guilty! Guilty!
Organizers began to feel under watch. Several filed Freedom of Information requests with the New York Police Department to obtain surveillance records related to Black Lives Matter. When the NYPD refused to turn over information, organizers sued.
Anything that the courts can force them to reveal is something that we think can only benefit the movement and us.
Nabil Hussain and Vienna Rai are plaintiffs in a lawsuit represented by the American Civil Liberties Union regarding alleged electronic surveillance by the NYPD.
That you were being watched. I frankly don't expect the NYPD to be transparent with us and tell us their tactics against us.
They suspect certain technology has been used to disrupt and intimidate them.
Phone powering off, and then it kind of became...
Vienna claims their phones may be a target.
Single march, my phone. There.
It just shut down?
And then look, I'll try it. Look. This is probably the 8th time it's been shut down tonight. And 54% battery, there's no problem with the phone.
The NYPD has used technology called Stingray in the past. It's used to sweep up people's cell phone information, but can potentially disrupt the phone as well.
You start to realize also like how important the phone is, right? In terms of being able to film the police if they were to do something, or being able to call a friend if they were to do something.
There have been similar reports from across the country as well. It's not something that is only in New York City.
So we requested that information.
Keegan Stephen, another local organizer, is part of a lawsuit that forced the NYPD to release text communications from undercover police.
We found out that there were numerous undercover officers.
Organizers believe these undercover police infiltrated the group to collect information.
These were private text loops that were not public text loops, and this undercover had access to them, so it would indicate that they were one of a very core member of organizers.
I pointed out to the court that what the NYPD is doing when they surveil Black Lives Matter is part of a long history of law enforcement organizations engaging in political conduct to try to subvert and thwart what they perceive as political enemies.
Dave Thompson is representing some of the organizers against the NYPD.
The greater goal behind all this is to cover up the extent of their political use of their police powers to oppose Black Lives Matter. Because when they undertake surveillance of Black Lives Matter, this is not law enforcement activity. Black Lives Matter is not breaking laws.
In the case of Vienna and Nabil, the department invoked a defense called GLOMAR, often used for national security threats where they will neither confirm nor deny they have any information. This strong response raises the suspicions of Vienna, Nabil, and their lawyers. The NYPD refused an interview request with fault lines.
How do you see your two situations, two different sets of lawsuits, looking at surveillance? How do you see them connecting?
It causes fractions within the movement, right? So there's many different ways that surveillance can manifest. So paranoia, internal conflicts, and at that point it does become demobilizing.
I mean, I think either technological surveillance or human surveillance, they're just different methods, right? Like the point is the same either way, which is to prevent organizing from happening or from being effective.
When we think of the police as kind of a neutral enforcer of the law, we understand that police should only undertake investigations where there's evidence of criminal wrongdoing.
Alex Vitale is a professor at Brooklyn College and has researched political policing for years.
But the history of political policing is a history of the surveillance of individuals and organizations based on their political beliefs, not on their criminal behavior.
In late October, we learned that Color of Change had a batch of documents they would share with us related to FBI surveillance of Black Lives Matter.
It's no small thing to conflate protest to hold the police accountable for gunning down unarmed Black people with a threat that has to be policed in a proactive and preemptive way.
Omar Farah at the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York is the lead attorney on this FOIA lawsuit. This is the first time the documents are being made public.
Are you seeing anything initially that is setting off alarm bells for you?
It certainly confirms that otherwise protected First Amendment activity that should really be celebrated is being looked at with a degree of suspicion that I think is reserved for Black and brown communities and for other minority groups.
Oh no, Mark, before you dig into it, let's call Brandy, because we spoke to Brandy recently, and see what she says.
This is Brandy.
Brandy, hi, it's Omar.
The first documents they pull up are a set of internal agency emails.
Starts off well, explaining that there's a range of protected activity that falls within the First Amendment and therefore should not be monitored or surveilled, but then says, however, based on known intelligence and or specific historical observations, it's possible that protected First Amendment activity might also invite violence that the FBI has to respond to.
This language would give the FBI a way to conduct surveillance of Black Lives Matter, based on a belief that violence could occur, but says they will stop if it does not.
But at that point, the damage has been done. The surveillance is what chills people from interacting and mobilizing and raising what we think are just indispensable voices to hold the government accountable for these kinds of things.
Brandy?
I'm curious. I would love to know more. What are those historical observations? Because civil rights protests historically do not escalate in violence. So what are they actually drawing from as they're building this narrative about violent reactions that they're presuming will happen?
Omar, let's look at another document.
Again, another chain of emails.
This document shows FBI notes from July 2016, after a Black gunman shot and killed 5 Dallas police officers. It happened during an anti-police brutality rally, but the shooter is believed to have acted alone and had no ties to Black Lives Matter.
A term that strikes us as a Black supremacist extremist. There's no definition in the document of what exactly that means, but that is one thing that certainly caught our eye, and that's been part of the subject that Brandy and I have been talking about as we go forward in the case.
Omar says the document raises more questions than it answers. But for Brandy, this term blurs the line between isolated violent incidents and the movement.
It's like trying to say that the BLM movement is on par with white nationalists and white extremist groups that are actively calling for violence, to say that that's on the same level. It's certainly the first time I saw black supremacist extremists that black and white in a document, and I hear it popping up now. I think it's very alarming.
This shooting would resurface in a recently leaked FBI memo. Published by Foreign Policy, the memo speaks of a so-called Black Identity Extremist, or BIE, movement in the US that is carrying out premeditated violent attacks on law enforcement. It says perceptions of police abuse feed this movement's ideology. Mike German, a former FBI agent, says the document cherry-picks isolated violent incidents against police to fit under this umbrella ideology.
It creates the notion that there is this broader criminal activity that these isolated incidents are part of. And that way they can justify broad surveillance, broad investigations against anybody who is out there protesting who has a black identity or is protesting about issues that impact communities of color.
The FBI declined to speak to us for this film, but they told us they do not open investigations based solely on race, national origin, religion, or the exercise of First Amendment rights. The Black Identity Extremist memo is dated just days before a gathering of white supremacy groups in Charlottesville, Virginia in August 2017. German says over the last few years, he's seen white supremacists openly calling for violence at these rallies. FBI records show they commit more attacks than any other group, but police have largely stood back.
These are people who are criminals, who are going there to commit violence, committing violence, and then somehow being allowed to go to the next protest and commit violence again. It's very shocking.
For many in the movement for Black lives who have been on the streets, the police response to Charlottesville has been a stark contrast to what they faced. Images from the protests shocked the world. Neighborhood streets look like war zones.
When you have a movement like Black Lives Matter or the other broader concerns about aggressive policing and over-policing, militaristic policing, they're actually challenging the police. They're challenging law enforcement.
We want peace. We don't want more. We want peace.
So law enforcement sees that as a threat to what they're doing. So they tend to view that kind of protest through a very different lens than white supremacists, say, who commit a lot of harm, but who they attack is very different.
Well, I think there is a kind of war on cops mentality that has come to dominate a lot of policing circles. And so they see any criticism of police as being tied to some of these extreme events where someone has gone and shot police officers, even though they have no connection to these movements.
16 shots! 16 shots!
It's been over 3 years since the Black Lives Matter movement began.
16 shots!
And the scope of surveillance is only now coming to light.
16 shots!
But organizers know enough to feel alarmed.
We are going through a period where police are being trained, have been trained to see Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives as a terrorist threat. I think that that's absolutely carrying out in terms of the level of surveillance that's happening.
The information released so far certainly raises concerns that law enforcement may have political motives behind its surveillance and is undermining people's basic rights to hold the government accountable.
How do you feel being put in that category of surveillance alongside groups where people will say, well, these people are a danger to society, to America?
There's no evidence, and I don't even feel the need to refute it because there's never any evidence presented that we're a threat to the public. What we are a threat to is the power of the state.
And when a new president in office has unleashed rhetoric that organizers say further demonizes the movement for Black lives, the stakes have grown higher.
When we organize, we have to organize out loud.
That could have been me. That could have been my brother. That could have been my son. Stop killing our kids.
This isn't about creating more fear or freezing our desire to fight and win and live in our dignity. This is about understanding what the landscape looks like and what the world of surveillance looks like and how police are watching us. You should know all of those things. You shouldn't stop fighting to get free. They win, then what's the point?
There is no end. There is no end.